All right, everybody ready for page 184? All righty, and probably we'll get through 185 as well. Suburban growth, page 184. With over half the population living in places with populations of more than 2,500 people, the United States in the 1920s was an urban rather than rural nation for the first time in its history. So remember, urban means city, rural means country. So people are moving to the cities for jobs because that is where all the industry was. Only the Great Depression ended the building boom that was part of this growth. The automobile made it possible to draw people to suburbs that grew even faster than cities. So suburbs are places right outside of cities. So for example, Liverpool, Baldwinsville, Jamesville, DeWitt, Fayetteville, Camillus, all those areas, those are suburbs. Okay, so people are moving to the suburbs because they have cars now. So now they can live out there and drive into work. So the automobile really changed society, all right? New regional, political, and economic units developed, resulting in the present-day conflict between urban and suburban needs, priorities, and values. So remember, urban equals city. Suburban equals towns next to cities, like Liverpool. Urban, city, suburban, towns next to cities like Liverpool. All right. Let's look at the document. It says analyzing documents. What information from the graph helps you gain a more complete picture of the effect of the automobile industry? So, what information from the graph helps you gain a more complete picture? So you can see in the graph, okay, you've got passenger cars, year, number of cars. So as soon as kind of the assembly line picks up, more people are able to buy cars. Alrighty. So you have millions of people buying cars. There's a little dip there in 1927, and then it's going to sharply increase in 1929. And then we're going to see something happen there. Okay? So what information from the graph helps you gain a more complete picture of the effect of the automobile? So you can see how many people are buying passenger cars. And so that's your answer for that question. You can see how many people are buying cars. All right, shifting cultural values. During the 1920s, American society experienced a struggle with social change as it became an urban industrial nation. Changes in lifestyle, values, morals, and manners increased tension and conflict. Wealth, possessions, having fun, and sexual freedom, ideas influenced by the psychology of Sigmund Freud, were the new values. Leisure. Leisure means like having free time, which you guys have a lot of right now. With a shorter work week and with more paid vacations, Americans had more leisure time. Movies such as my husband's favorite, The Ten Commandments, the first movie with sound, The Jazz Singer, drew millions of people a week to theaters during the 1920s. Americans idolized Charlie Chaplin and other movie stars. They also admired sports figures such as Babe Ruth. After his 1927 solo transatlantic flight, Charles Lindbergh became an overnight hero. Listening to the radio and to records were two other popular pastimes. Games such as bridge, crossword puzzles, and the board games of Mahjong swept the country. The popular image of young women in the 1920s was the flapper, a young, pretty woman with bobbed hair and raised hemlines. Ooh. She drank alcohol. Ooh. She smoked, and she thought for herself. The flapper was featured in movies, magazines, advertising, and novels, such as those of F. Scott Fitzgerald. The flapper was an expression of women's new sense of independence, a statement of change, even rebellion. As such, the flapper represented another example in the debate over traditional versus modern values that was driving the nation. Literature. The conflict and concern created by changing American values also saw expression in literature. American writers of the 1920s protested the effects of technology and mass consumption. They criticized the business mentality, the conformity of the times, and the preoccupation with material things. Some writers, such as Ernest Hemingway, became expatriates, leaving the United States to settle in Europe. Often called the Lost Generation, these writers of the 20s produced some of the most enduring works of American literature. All right, the Harlem Renaissance. Mrs. Wall has talked to you guys about this. One of the most influential cultural movements of the 1920s was the Harlem Renaissance. So remember last year, I'm sure that Mr. Crisafulli told you guys about, or you talked about the Renaissance, or maybe it was Global One. But remember, Renaissance means a change or like a rebirth. And so Harlem is where a lot of African Americans are going to be living. And so they are kind of bringing their culture back to life during this time. One of the most influential cultural movements of the 1920s was the Harlem Renaissance, led by a group of African American writers in the New York City neighborhood of Harlem. These creative intellectual figures, mainly well-educated members of the middle class, felt alienated from society in the 1920s. In their works, they called for action against bigotry and expressed pride in African American culture and identity. Outstanding literary figures of the Harlem Renaissance included W.E.B. Du Bois, who we talked about, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Alain Locke. So the Regents will ask you about Langston Hughes, so that's who you need to focus on. The Great Depression of the 1930s ended the Harlem Renaissance, cutting the sales of books and literary magazines. However, during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the writers of the Harlem Renaissance and their works attracted renewed interest. African American artists, musicians, and dancers also participated in the Harlem Renaissance. Black musicians in the South blended elements of African, European, and American music to create the distinctive sounds of jazz and the blues. This music was carried all over the country and abroad. Edward Duke Ellington is one of the most towering figures in jazz. Ellington recorded and composed music performed on the piano and conducted his own orchestra until his death in 1974. Bessie Smith, known as the Empress of the Blues, was one of the most popular singers in the 1920s. The new music, to which people dance such daring new steps, such as the Charleston, became so popular that the period of the 1920s is often called the Jazz Age. Okay, so let's look at your questions. So we're going to start with this one. Analyzing documents, primary sources. We build our temples for tomorrow, strong as we know how, and we stand on the top of the mountain free within ourselves. Langston Hughes on the Harlem Renaissance. What ideas of the Harlem Renaissance are expressed in this quote? Well, remember, the Harlem Renaissance was a rebirth of African American culture. So he's talking about how they finally feel free to express their culture. When he says free within ourselves, he's talking about expressing themselves freely finally. And then we have Langston Hughes wrote from the 1920s until his death in 1967. What other themes do you see in his poems? I, too, sing America. You went over that with Mrs. Wall, maybe. One-way ticket. Harlem, dream deferred. Don't worry about that question because we're not going over that. So, look, if you're watching this video, you know you don't have to do that question. All right, let's look at preparing for the exam. The cultural and intellectual life of a time period reflects the era's social, economic, and political mood. First one, how did the work of each writer in the chart reflect the 1920s? Oh, you guys don't have to do this. That's right. All right, so that is all for page 184 to 185. Probably on Monday. Let me look and see when everything is due again. All right, so yeah, so Monday I will, or maybe later today, I'll post more videos, or maybe over the weekend. So keep checking. I know you guys have other work and that you have other responsibilities to do right now, but keep checking, and I will keep posting these videos as long as you guys like them. Talk to you later. See ya. Bye.